Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to do something really exciting. We are completely dismantling that narrow, kind of compressed narrative of Black history you might have learned in a quick school unit squeezed somewhere between Thanksgiving and winter break. I'm absolutely thrilled to guide you through this, because when we look at the actual historical record, drawn from archaeology, primary sources, and modern research, what we find is a story that's vastly richer, longer, and honestly way more triumphant than the standard curriculum suggests.
Since standard textbooks tend to flatten this massive topic, our agenda today is going to take us on a sweeping journey through the actual historical record. We'll be looking at rethinking the historical record, the ancient African empires, enslavement and relentless resistance, civil rights and global liberation, and finally, the pillars of Black life. We've got a lot of fascinating ground to cover, so let's jump right in.
Kicking things off with Section 1, Rethinking the Historical Record. The true opening chapter. Understanding that history is typically written by the victors, the conquerors and colonial administrators, is a genuinely necessary first step to grasping everything else we're going to talk about today.
There's this stark, myth-busting contrast between what we're taught and what actually happened. The standard curriculum, which was often shaped by colonial administrators who had a lot to gain from hiding the truth, usually treats Black history as this brief middle chapter focused purely on subjugation. But look at the actual record on the right. Modern research shows an ancient, triumphant, and continuous progression pieced together from deep archaeology and rich oral traditions.
To put this into perspective, we're talking about 100,000 years. Every human alive today traces their ancestry right back to Africa. So Black history isn't just some inserted chapter, it's literally the opening 100,000 years of the entire human story. For tens of thousands of years, African societies were adapting and developing incredibly rich knowledge systems long before any external contact.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Ancient African Empires, a golden age of statecraft. Let's see how this early history builds into a golden age of ancient African states, whose sheer scale genuinely surprised European visitors when contact eventually happened.
This timeline completely shatters the myth of an uncivilized pre-colonial Africa. Just look at this progression. First, you have the Kingdom of Kush, where Nubian pharaohs actually ruled Egypt. Then the Aksumite Kingdom, adopting state Christianity all the way back in the 4th century. Later on, Grey Zimbabwe, a massive, precisely constructed stone trading city. And finally, the medieval West African empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, which controlled global trade for 1,000 years.
To understand just how powerful these empires were, let's zoom in on Mali for a second. In 1324, Mali's ruler Mansa Musa went on a pilgrimage with tens of thousands of people, and he carried so much gold with him that it literally crashed the Mediterranean gold market for over a decade. I mean, that's a level of wealth and economic power that is almost hard to comprehend.
Moving right along into Section 3, Enslavement and Relentless Resistance, the Disruption of Civilizations. As we look at this era, we really have to reframe how we view the transatlantic slave trade. It's crucial to understand that this was not a beginning. It was the systematic disruption and destruction of those already advanced civilizations we just talked about.
The sheer scale here is staggering. 10 to 12 million. That is the number of Africans who survived the horrific ocean crossing to the Americas. And this forced labor concretely built the economic foundations of our modern world. The agricultural surplus generated by these individuals is what fueled the industrial development of Europe and North America.
But here's the thing, despite that extraordinary violence, enslaved communities maintained their internal social worlds, and they relentlessly resisted. Which prompts a really important question for us today. How do we view the Haitian Revolution of the 1790s? Was it just a simple rebellion, or was it actually one of modern history's most extraordinary political events?
The reality is absolutely staggering. Enslaved people actually overthrew Napoleon's global military force. Then, in 1804, they established the first free Black republic in the Western Hemisphere. It was an immense victory. But the global response was brutal. France essentially forced Haiti to pay billions in modern dollars as reparations for the loss of their enslaved labor, and Haiti was paying that off until 1947.
That relentless thread of agency brings us to Section 4. Civil rights and global liberation, the architecture of freedom. Now we're going to zoom out and look at the macro view of the fight for political rights across the globe in the 19th and 20th centuries.
In the U.S., the era of Reconstruction brought a period of extraordinary political possibility. We're talking about voting, building institutions, and even holding Senate seats. But notice the stark contrast here. This wasn't a failure. It was deliberately dismantled by organized, violent white supremacist campaigns. And that led directly into Jim Crow, which meant a century of legal segregation and economic subjugation.
And that brings us to the mid-20th century. Now, you've likely been taught that the U.S. civil rights movement was just this moral appeal to the American conscience, right? Well, actually, scratch that. It was deeply organizationally disciplined. They used strategic economic pressure and deliberate confrontational tactics to expose segregation's violence to an international audience, right when the Cold War made American racial practices a huge diplomatic liability.
Simultaneously, we see massive global shifts happening. On the left, there's African decolonization, a really rapid transformation from just a handful of states in 1945 to dozens by 1970. And on the right, contrasting sharply with that, is South African apartheid. Instituted in 1948, this was an elaborate system of racial domination that was fiercely resisted by the ANC for decades. Finally, let's explore Section 5, the pillars of Black life, women, art, and faith. These are the unsung foundational pillars that truly sustained and propelled these global communities through every single era we've discussed today. We absolutely must recover the central role of Black women in this history. Harriet Tubman didn't just escape, she made 19 harrowing missions back into slave territory. Ida B. Wells spearheaded fearless investigative anti-lynching journalism in the 1890s, and the women of the civil rights movement, like Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Diane Nash, they weren't just supporting characters. They were the primary organizers, providing the sustained infrastructure that made the whole movement possible.
This active resistance was also deeply intellectual. Thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois produced incredible social frameworks. As the quote here says, his concept of double consciousness remains one of the most durable and generative frameworks in American social thought. These ideas brilliantly expose the true operations of power, and they remain incredibly relevant for us today.
And you know, that intellectual brilliance flowed directly into cultural production. Just look at this list. The blues from the Mississippi Delta, jazz from New Orleans, Chicago, and New York, gospel, soul, funk, rhythm and blues, hip-hop. Essentially, every major American popular music genre was birthed from these communities as a form of genuine political work and cultural expression under oppressive conditions.
And we definitely can't ignore faith. Enslaved people creatively adapted by building what we call syncretic traditions. These were spiritual frameworks, like Vodou, Candomblé, and Santeria, that merged African theology with Catholicism. They served simultaneously as spiritual practice, cultural preservation, and a highly sophisticated form of encoded resistance that gave later movements much of their moral language.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer. We've seen a history that is ancient, prosperous, and organizationally brilliant. It's a story of profound intellectual wealth under the most difficult conditions imaginable. So I want to leave you with this final thought. Will you continue to view Black history as a brief chapter of victimization, or explore it further as one of the longest, most consequential global stories in the human record? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.